They're clearly moving the world into a more type of global governance. And we're seeing that with this climate deal in Paris. We see that with banking regulations. We see that with the power of Wall Street. We likely see price controls. We'll see wage controls, limits on what money you can take out of your out of your bank account. But we're also going to see people controls, Kenneth, and it's whether it's the IRS. If you owe the IRS money, you can't leave the United States, or we're already beginning to see these things. The New World Order, I think, are just really the 1% of 1% that have a vested interest in exercising more power and influence over the masses.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into CrushTheStreet.com. I'm joined today with a special guest. He is an expert when it comes to talking about and promoting the principles of our constitutional republic and economic liberty and exposing the corrupted New World Order political establishment. His name is Fabian Calvo, and his website is fabianforliberty.com. And we're going to talk today about what's going on with the world, and we do have a lot to talk about today. Fabian, thanks for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Kenneth. Love Crush the Street, and it's a pleasure to be on.
Thanks so much. Well, I'm looking at the headlines, and it is bad. The stock market, the Dow Jones has dipped 500 points. It's only down 376 right now as we do this interview, but all the headlines are bad. London FTSE 100 enters a bear market in 5 charts. Why China can't keep a stock rally going. Things are coming unhinged. And let's start off with this. Is this a controlled meltdown, or is the powers that be losing control of everything they had together?
Well, you could argue it either way. My opinion is that this is a controlled leg down that we're seeing. Personally, I think that the manipulated stock market, and really every asset class, it's manipulated by the big banks mostly, and the Federal Reserve. They're likely going to pull out all the stops, Kenneth, before we actually see what many have called the economic collapse. That I think anybody with any room temperature IQ that just briefs the economic headlines know is inevitable.
What is the next stop then? Is it bail-ins? Is it negative interest rates? More QE? What is the next stop?
Yeah, I think certainly this year we'll see negative. We could have the potential to see negative interest rates in the United States. Janet Yellen's already on record talking about this. I think more monetary stimulus could happen as well. But I think with China's economy clearly in turmoil, today you have George Soros saying that the EU may fall apart. He's also talked about this repeating 2008 as well, the financial crash. That we could potentially see, Kenneth, a global stimulus that takes place by the G7, G8 countries in order to really ramp this thing up. Because, when this economic collapse, when this business cycle comes to an end, it's not just going to be stocks and, some commodities or real estate. I think we're going to be looking at things like the dollar, the bond market, and all the other market manipulations and bubbles that have been created, from subprime car loans to student debt. I think we'll simultaneously see those bubbles collapse, and so I think that they're going to go all out, pull out all the stops prior to that actually taking place.
So what are your thoughts with what's going on in China? Is China the nail in the coffin for what we are seeing today, or was it rising interest rates, the end of systemic leverage? What's happening with your thoughts in China?
Well, they've been the leader in global debt accumulation. And I think what China's seeing right now is going to be like what the United States saw in the early 1930s. They're going to go through a similar Great Depression. I still think that, again, when you have some real powerful players, whether it's Bill Gates, whether it's George Soros, whether it's the multitude of investments that the big banks have made in China, Warren Buffett, all of these guys are talking about China being the leader of the economy in the 21st century, the new engine of growth, to quote George Soros. And so I think that they're likely going to hit a major depression, but they'll continue. Their economy will eventually recover. So it's not game over for China, I believe, like it was for the Japanese after the 80s, where, they've been in this, I think they're on QE 8 or 9 now, and they've been battling inflation ever since. I think China will ultimately rebound, and I think that the world, unfortunately for liberty and unfortunately for those of us that believe in principles of the Constitution, economies around the world are moving towards this kind of state-run capitalism, which we would likely deem here crony capitalism. And I think that's the direction things are headed.
So you follow and you expose what is going on with the New World Order. And can you explain this to people? Because sometimes this might have different meanings depending on who you talk to. So explain your thoughts on the New World Order and kind of how it relates to what we're seeing now with this economic collapse. And your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So, yeah, you're right. There's a lot of definitions for the New World Order. Some people will talk about like the Illuminati or, these secret societies. I kind of keep it more simple. Or they'll say, it's a Zionist thing and it's, a certain religion that somehow controls the world. I really disagree with those. I think it's more so it's funny. My name's obviously Fabian, and many people may or may not have heard of the Fabian socialist movement. And their logo is basically a guy that is remolding the world to their heart's desire. Now, what does that mean? I think that, you have very powerful interests, many of which we probably don't even know the names of, a few of which I've already mentioned, and they're clearly moving the world into a more type of global governance. And we're seeing that with this climate deal in Paris. We see that with banking regulations. We see that with the power of Wall Street, and we see that, clearly failing with the euro, but they continue to double down, or the EU, I should say. They continue to double down on these policies. And ultimately what it is, it's a small group of individuals that want to control society. It's interesting. We started off this conversation with the market crash and things like, and what happens from that. So, we'll likely see price controls. We'll see wage controls, limits on what money you can take out of your out of your bank account. But we're also going to see people controls, Kenneth, and it's whether it's the IRS. If you owe the IRS money, you can't leave the United States, or we're already beginning to see these things. And so, yeah, the New World Order, I think, are just really the 1% of 1% that have a vested interest in exercising more power and influence over the masses. And the truth is, unfortunately, they own the majority of media. They own the majority of the banks. They own the Federal Reserve. And their power is very, very, it's big. So that actually circles back, Kenneth, to one of the discussions I was talking about yesterday. I think these same interests, for example, here politically at home, they want someone like a Hillary Clinton to win. They're the big banks, the hedge fund guys are backing her. Soros is backing her. So that's one of the reasons that I don't necessarily think we'll see the collapse prior to the election, because if the economy does collapse, it's really Obama and the Democratic Party's economy that is collapsing, and their policies clearly failing. So I think that these guys will continue to hang on, continue to manipulate this thing until she's in office, or they try to get her in office.
So the way they can control people, of course, there's kind of multiple ways. But if the economy does collapse and it's kind of led by the stock market, people come to their knees, and then they need the globalist elite system to answer to them and to respond to that quote unquote need, and that would be a way for them to control everyone. Of course, the system collapsing, the stock markets is a problem, because I think Mike Maloney has statistics for every 50% the stock market loses in value, 25% of their revenue and taxes gets lost. So there's some interesting dynamics with what is going on. A lot of moving parts. The dollar, is it going to go to a global currency, a basket of currencies, something like the SDR? I know I said a lot of things there, but just your thoughts on them taking the system down, and the people needing the elites in power to respond to their needs.
Well, we certainly saw this in 2008, where you had the AIG, an insurance company, basically go bankrupt, and somehow it could have gone bankrupt, and they were on TV, people like Hank Paulson and others, talking about how that was going to, in essence, had the likelihood of wiping out grandma and grandpa's savings account. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. They actually used that crisis to end up bailing out Wall Street dollars. Today, 8 years later, the big banks on Wall Street are 50% bigger. So yeah, it's absolutely they used a crisis to gain more power, exercise more control. Another thing I think that we're seeing right now in the market that I think really all these headlines are tied together, and it all goes back to economics. But it's not economics alone. Yes, you and I can sit here and talk about the global amounts of debt, the derivatives, all these things that are adding pressure. Certainly oil tanking is adding pressure. But I think the geopolitical what's happening geopolitically, I think, is just as big news. And unfortunately, it's not. It doesn't tend to be tied into what investors, what their outlook is for markets. And I think one of the biggest geopolitical hot topics right now is this confrontation between Iran and the Saudis that could really trigger a gigantic civil war throughout the Middle East. And Saudi Arabia still exports 10 million barrels of oil a day. If that stops, that would be a significant impact to the global economy that still runs on oil, even though there's a major glut of oil right now on the market. So I think that, we have all of these different issues that are taking place, and it's really a multifaceted thing. It's no longer where it's just, the stock market's collapsing because of XYZ reasons. I mean, stock markets could be collapsing because North Korea detonates a hydrogen bomb, instability in the Middle East. There's really a lot of different reasons.
Mm. So in that same vein, you brought up the Middle East and it brought up the petrodollar. What do you see as the New World Order agenda when it comes to currency? And your thoughts on that? I mean, kind of how it relates to what is going on in the Middle East. Is the powers agenda working right now in the Middle East?
Yeah, I certainly think they are. I mean, look, I think if Saudi Arabia enters in some kind of war, their oil revenues are hurt. If there is a fracturing of OPEC, that's all major trouble for the petrodollar, which is really, all oil is in essence traded in U.S. dollars. It creates this artificial demand for the U.S. dollar. Even though the U.S. isn't providing a service, they're not providing anything, really. They're just a middleman collecting a fee. And the rest of the world's catching on to this. And we've seen this already happening for a number of years where they're entering into these bilateral trade agreements, ditching the dollar. So, yeah, I think that the petrodollar is on the way out. When it'll happen, I don't know, Kenneth, but when it does go down, it's going to spell serious trouble. I've been talking for years now how the U.S. dollar, which is the world reserve currency, is ultimately going to lose its status as the world reserve currency, likely first replaced by a basket of currencies. And I'm asked all the time, well, what will happen here at home? And what will happen very simply is we'll look at the cost of living. It'll be more like in Europe. What I mean by that is basically where the price of living, the cost of living will increase substantially here at home. I mean, Americans really don't understand that the reason things are cheaper here is because there's this artificial demand for U.S. dollars. That's not going to last forever. And history shows us that it doesn't last forever. I mean, we've had 6 global resets in the past, 6 world reserve currencies that have transferred. We're on the precedent, I believe, the 7th one. And I think, again, circling back to the beginning of the conversation, when this economy does collapse, I think that's going to be the significant component to the end of this current business cycle will be the transition, the world transitioning away from the dollar as the sole currency that's used into more of a basket of currencies.
Fabian, do you think that it's going to be the same elitists, though, in control of the basket of the new money that is used? Or is it just these elites, they're going to lose their power with the dollar and it'll be transferred to some other fiat currency?
Well, that is actually a great question, Kenneth, because I'll circle back to politics. I had a conversation with a pretty well-known political consultant one time, asking him, well, why isn't there a third party that runs in this country and a third party that's formed? And he said, well, it's much easier to take over an existing party than it is to start your own party. And I look at that with, like, for example, if the dollar goes down in flames, which I believe ultimately it will, I don't mean it's going to go to zero, and I think we'll still use dollars here. But I don't believe that countries like the Iranians or the Chinese, countries in the East, necessarily are going to be comfortable with the IMF the World Bank and these Western institutions still running the global game of money. So what we'll likely see is a takeover, and we've seen, the head of the IMF even say that, that as things in the economy change, there'd be the potential for the IMF to move their headquarters out of Washington, D.C. To Beijing. So yeah, I think that the new players that will exercise more influence in the currency, the global currency, will likely take over these institutions that are currently in place and form others like the Chinese have already been doing.
Yeah, no, I interesting thoughts on that. Obviously, there's some different scenarios, but I mean, that totally makes sense. Being able to just go in and take over what's already there. In a lot of ways, like the Tea Party, just on one example, was hijacked by the Republican Party in a certain sense. And it was meant to be one thing, but then it kind of got taken over by the establishment sort of mentality. And on that note, Fabian, I'd like to get your thoughts on the presidential election. I mean, are we going to have Hillary as our president here in 2016?
Well, like I said, I think that if they are able to keep the Ponzi scheme economy up without significant turmoil and headwinds like we've seen in 2008, I think there's a likelihood she wins. The Republican Party, I think, is likely over. If Donald Trump wins the nomination, I mean, it's going to send a hellfire missile to the heart. It already has, to the heart of the GOP establishment. At the end of the day, really, Kenneth, I don't really see, there's no Ron Paul type politicians that are running for office.
You're right.
Donald Trump is really a populist. It's been interesting to see a lot of people that, follow my YouTube channel and that would deem themselves more libertarian minded support him. And the truth is, the reality is, he has a very liberal, he has a past of supporting very liberal causes.
Yeah.
And what scares me the most really is that I've seen Trump supporters being interviewed, they really don't know, they couldn't tell you, the difference between what's happening in Ukraine to what's happening in the Middle East or negative interest rates or QE. They're really uninformed voters, and they're the same type of voters, but this time they're on the right, that voted for Barack Obama. We've seen what we got, a guy that basically didn't really talk about any policy. It was more kind of talking in this populism that the country in 2008 wanted to hear and obviously supported. So it's for me personally, it's frightening to see that any one of these people will eventually be leading the country and in charge of the executive office.
Yeah, I definitely can see Trump gaining a lot of ground and more ground as if we see the stock markets continue to fall, because that's a very Main Street type indicator. People see that. People feel it when they see their 401ks fall. Fabian, I wanted to get your thoughts because you're a big proponent for thriving in your own economy and kind of in a more conclusion, wrap-up sort of way. I mean, what is your advice for people when it comes to living their life and being happy? Because we only have so many days here on Earth, and you can only spend your time living in a cave for so long before you age, get old, and die. So, yeah. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'll tell you, Kenneth, I mean, we've spent, the last 15 minutes or so talking about things that are not rosy. These are things that rarely are discussed, even on financial networks. Rarely do they get into some of the things that we've talked about. And, the outlook based on that alone is not a good one. But I personally think that, there's a lot of good things that are going on. The biggest good thing is that this is, in my opinion, the best time ever for someone to be an entrepreneur. I'm a real estate entrepreneur, but there's a multitude of different industries and fields and ways that people can become an entrepreneur today because of the internet. It's completely changed the dynamic of being able to start a business with very little capital, test your idea, where in the past, you needed to spend a lot of capital to just test an idea. Today, you could almost do it for free on the internet. So I think that that's a big plus. So, I like to refer to it as the golden age of business, is providing knowledge, providing a service, or providing a product and leveraging the power of the internet to now reach a global marketplace. So, I think there's a lot of good things going on. And, I often talk about, Kenneth, of this idea of the job paradigm, which is clearly failing. The idea that you're going to get a job, go to college, get a good job. I mean, that is done. That idea is over. So, I think the best investment someone can make right now is investing in themselves, investing in knowledge, to basically become self-reliant, because that's what it's going to take. I mean, clearly, government social programs are going bankrupt and failing. This promise that government can somehow, make things better or take care of people that have bought into that, I feel bad for them because they're going to be miserable. But I think with everything said, I think that there is still tremendous opportunity. People need to understand that in a crisis or collapse, I mean, for me in my business, 2009, 2010 were some of the best years I had. In a crisis or collapse, that's one of the best opportunities there are for people to get involved and to people to take advantage of those markets that have deflated in a major way. So, I'm an optimist at heart, despite of the things that we've just talked about, which I think are fundamental truths. I mean, just because I'm an optimist, I don't wear rose-colored glasses and think everything's going to be great. I'm a realist, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of opportunity out there.
Fabian, and just your last comments. I know you're a real estate entrepreneur, and you've been doing this for many years now. I wanted to get your thoughts on U.S. real estate and just how the current economy will have an impact on real estate prices, if you wouldn't mind commenting on that.
Yeah, so I think, we're already seeing major real estate devaluations happening, specifically in areas where their economies are centered around oil. We're seeing this in Louisiana. We're seeing this in the Dakotas. I think this year we'll continue to see pricing in real estate go up modestly. And that's because, again, real estate, like any market, is a manipulated market. And you have Fannie Mae, FHA, you have them, beginning to really ramp up loans. In many cases, loans that are given to most of the time given to uncreditworthy borrowers. And again, it's just another type of stimulus, backdoor stimulus, if you will. So that will keep prices, I believe, somewhat stable. But again, when the shoe drops, real estate